So with infographics, the first thing you need to think about before you put anything onto the page, or you start to think about design or even messaging, is you actually have to think a little bit about who your audience is going to be. This is really important because the whole notion of infographics is they are a targeted way of getting information across to a particular audience. So the first thing you have to start out with is making that decision when you're building your infographic about who is this aimed at. And so to do that, you have to perhaps think a little bit in terms of the context of infographics that are perhaps already out there, and consider kind of typical infographics that we know about, and think, well, who were they aimed at? You know, what was the population group that these infographics were designed for? So, for example, if we look at this infographic here, the audience is probably quite clear. It's aimed very much at the general population. How active are we? So we need to think a little bit about kind of the audience. If we look at this example here, again, adult physical activities. Who is the audience here? This is a public health message. So you can read from the infographic and see visually from the infographic that it is aimed very much at the general population, trying to get that message across to the general population. So when you are constructing your own infographic, the first thing to do is define your audience. Now, you may argue, well, I'm doing an infographic within maybe the field of sport and exercise sciences, so you think you know who the audience is. But actually, there's some really big questions to ask yourself before you commit to building the infographic. And the way to do this is creating what's referred to in design terms of a persona. And it's based upon these, what we call archetypal components, which relate to the places of life, the pace of life, some life variables, and the skills. So the first thing to think a little bit about is, in terms of who your audience is with the places of life, is, well, where is your audience typically getting their information from? So where would their information come from? So, for example, if your audience was aimed at teenagers, then you know that the majority of their information comes from places like TikTok and Twitter and so on. Now, that is not about you positioning where your infographic is going to go, but it tells you the kind of messaging that they are getting other information from. So it gives you a sense of the way they'd be getting their information. Pace of life is time. So that is telling us that, really, most people will argue that they are time limited, time constrained. So that again tells you that when you're building an infographic, that you don't want it to be overly complicated. You don't want it to be something that they've got to root around in to get information from. It's got to be easily read. And so again, if we look at some of these kind of worked examples, notice how easy that is to read. That there is no rooting around, that the 2/3 of men meet national physical activity recommendations. They state it, but visually you can also see it. And the same with the one at the bottom, around a half of women meet the national physical activity recommendations. You can see it visually. You don't have to make any calculations or do any of the actual work. So it's not a time limiting infographic. Then you have to think about life variables. So we have to think a little bit about life experiences. What experiences are your audience, your archetypal audience that you're referring to? What background do they come from? So are you aiming at coaches? Are you aiming at sports scientists? Are you aiming it at physiologists? Or is it aimed at athletes in general? And what are their typical behaviours and opinions? Now, to a certain degree, if you were really working within the field of infographic design, you would actually run some focus groups. And you get a focus group in, and you would actually find out about what the behaviours and experiences are. But you perhaps, for putting infographics together at the moment, can actually maybe base that on just context from your own peer group. What are the kind of specific experiences, behaviours and opinions? So these are the ones that relate to the domain that you're actually focusing on. So if it is something which is to do with sport or the demands of a sport, for example, then what experiences do those people have? So if they're coaches, do they have that kind of experience? Do they have those kind of behaviours? And then the final one is the skills. And this is a really important one. What is the audience's familiarity with things like terminology and numeracy? And you've got to be careful here, and I would always say err on the side of caution with this. That remember that the first thing I was talking about was time is a factor, and you don't want people to have to rootle around in your infographics. So what you want to make sure is that they can easily access the information. So don't use terminology that's going to be unfamiliar to your audience. Don't use requirements, which means they've got to make numeric or numerical calculations. So when you are building your infographic, always start with this here. Who is your audience?